It's my great pleasure to welcome Patricia Nakache, General Partner at Trinity Ventures. I think I pronounced Patricia a little bit in a Latin format because I'm constantly hanging out with all these people from Europe and Latin America and so forth. But Patricia is American, so I think you use the pronunciation Patricia, right?
That's right, Patricia, that's right.
Well, welcome. I've known Patricia for a long time. So it's great to hang out with you here today.
Likewise. Thank you for having me.
So, Patricia, let's start by introducing our audience to yourself as well as to Trinity, a bit of context setting. Tell us about the fund and you know what you guys have been doing, etc.
Yeah, sure. So Trinity has a long and storied history. The fund was founded 30 years ago by a gentleman named Noel Fenton, who's still a partner, though semi-retired at this point. But he founded Trinity 30 years ago. He had been the CEO of 3 venture-backed startups, and had interacted with lots of venture capitalists over those years, and had come to the point of view that he thought that he could improve on the venture model, if you will. He could build a better venture capital firm, and one that was built on the types of values that he really treasured as a venture-backed CEO. An important one, which is sort of mutual respect with the entrepreneur. And so we are very, sort of culturally from our roots, a very collaborative firm, both internally and externally. A lot of teamwork amongst the partners here, no silos among, within the partnership, and also very collaborative with our entrepreneurs. We really put an emphasis on forming a partnership with our entrepreneurs. And so we are currently investing Trinity 12. So it's our 12th venture fund. It's a $400 million fund. We invest everywhere from seed stage to Series B. Our sweet spot's really Series A, but we'll do that whole spectrum. And we invest across technology sectors. I mean, our focus is early stage North America technology. And within technology, there are quite a few different areas that we spend time on, but broadly speaking, anything within technology would be within our purview.
So, Patricia, you have been in this industry now for quite a long time and watched many of the cycles that we have gone through. Venture capital has changed. The technology industry has seen many different waves, trends, etc. What is your current analysis, and give us a little bit of historical perspective as well as your current assessment of where things are, what are the changes, and how are you and Trinity thinking about those changes?
So, yeah, I joined the venture world in the summer of 1999, so just almost at the peak of the dot-com bubble, and very quickly kind of saw that market collapse. And if any of the participants in this roundtable remember those days, and many of you may not even, entrepreneurship may not have been on your radar at all at that point, but there was like various waves, right? There was like the dot-com consumer bubble that kind of collapsed, and then it was the B2B bubble, and then it was the telecom. Actually, the huge collapse was the telecom collapse. The reason that was particularly painful for a lot of investors and entrepreneurs is that was a very capital-intensive industry. So, and then we sort of went through a fairly quiet period in the venture world, sort of that, 2001 to 2003 or 4. It was relatively quiet. Actually, turns out in retrospect, it would have been a great time to invest, as always turns out to be in retrospect, and a good time to start a company too. That in these lulls, when there's sort of disenchantment or disillusionment, And that's actually a great time to think about starting a company because nobody else is really paying attention, and there's just less competition. And then market picked back up. Of course, in 2008 we had the housing crisis, and that definitely impacted, as the Great Recession, that definitely impacted funding activity, particularly in Silicon Valley. But then probably, 2009, 2010, things have picked up, and it's been fairly positive for the past. I mean, it's been a fairly, up and to the right momentum market for the past 8 years or so. Now, I would say that we maybe peaked 2 years ago in terms of the froth. I think there's still a lot of capital available. That's the good news. I think, though, whereas 2 or 3 years ago, getting funding, particularly at the seed stage, was relatively easy. It's never easy, but relatively easy. I would say now there's more of this, bifurcation of the market of the haves and have-nots, and we read in the paper and read on TechCrunch and a lot about the haves. But there's probably, a larger pool of companies that are just having a harder time raising money, probably because people are sort of like have a bit of a hangover from the peak 2 or 3 years ago where they probably invested very quickly, and it sort of, maybe had some, realizations that some of the bets they made weren't the best ones. So anyway, I would say right now we're in a period that's relatively healthy for entrepreneurs. For venture capitalists, I'd say, there's a lot of capital out there. So it's from, I would say, relative to 19 years ago when I started in the industry, it is far more competitive for venture capitalists to invest in good opportunities. And I would say that it requires a lot more specialization than it did in the past, where venture capitalists have had to go a lot deeper and sort of build their credibility in specific areas, because there are options available for entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs want to partner with someone who actually knows something, potentially can be value add to them in building their business. So anyway, that's a long-winded answer, Sharmana, but hopefully that got at some of the things you were looking for.
And what, if you look at your deal flow in the last, let's say 15 months, the 2017 till now deal flow, what are you seeing as far as trends and highlights? Not necessarily only the ones that you've invested in, but just if you look at the deal flow, what is significant, what stands out?
Well, there are definitely themes that are way more prevalent, and I would say some of those themes are certainly, and this isn't my particular area of expertise, it's one of my partners who's our fintech partner, but we're seeing a lot more blockchain and cryptocurrency-related ideas and opportunities. Certainly, across sectors, there's a lot of emphasis on leveraging artificial intelligence to bring efficiency and productivity to different sectors. I would say we're probably seeing a lot more happening in the whole realm of digital health. That's an interesting area where we're seeing a lot more. I'd say in the food and beverage sector, a lot more activity happening there, which is interesting. Interesting in particular for Trinity, because we have this sort of interesting history in that, and I didn't mention this when I was talking about our history, but at the outset of Trinity, the firm actually invested in bricks and mortar retail as well as in technology, not just technology. And some of the bricks and mortar companies we invested in included, we were the first institutional investors in Starbucks, we were the institutional investors in Tip Tangs and Jamba Juice. So we actually have a fair bit of historical sort of food and beverage, kind of traditional bricks and mortar experience. So it's been interesting to see some of these new food and beverage concepts, and we can sort of bring some interesting perspective to those. So those are some of the themes that we're seeing. There's some sectors that we have been very active in historically, and I'll pick one that I'm personally involved in, which is real estate tech, which we've been involved with since actually the .com days. We were the first institutional investors in a company called LoopNet, which is the first online marketplace for commercial real estate that we invested in, took that company public, and then actually did a PIPE in the public company before it was sold to CoStar. So it was a very long-term and productive relationship for us. That was our first real estate tech investment, and we've been very active in that sector over the years. But just in the past 3 years, I would say, 3 or 4 years, it's become very active across the venture landscape, and it's been interesting to see. We spend time in that sector, and I personally can spend a lot of time there just given the amount of activity going on.
And what are some examples of interesting concepts in the real estate tech space? Have you invested in some in the last year?
Yes, we've invested in a few.
Let's talk about those.
So, yeah. I mean, one that I invested in not about a year ago is a company that was started by actually the former president of LoopNet. It's a company called Real Nexus, and he is creating both both marketplace and workflow tools around retail real estate availability, and trying to provide sort of real-time access to availability information, both in terms of what's currently available, what should be coming available, and based on leases and whatnot. So that's one area that we made an investment in recently. We're investors in a company in New York called VTS, View the Space. Well, it used to be called View the Space. They shortened it to VTS, which is a CRM platform for commercial real estate. So, it's actually interesting to see how some, I think historically a lot of SaaS concepts were more horizontal, and now we're seeing a lot of really interesting deep vertical solutions, particularly for very large verticals, real estate being one, obvious one, and healthcare and fintech. I mean, there's a bunch of really big, meaty verticals, and it's sort of interesting to see some of these technology solutions evolve for those verticals.
Yeah, interesting. And in terms of stage, you said you do seed Series A and Series B, your sweet spot being Series A. What is your definition of Series A? What do you like to see if you are ready to do a Series A investment? What do you like to see in the project? What kind of validation are you looking for?
Yeah, I mean, ideally we would, for Series A, ideally we would want to see some product market fit. Now, it might just be sort of an initial target market, and the product roadmap might leave room for a lot of evolution and sort of expanding the market opportunity, but I think we'd at least want to see some initial product market fit. And there's sort of this kind of rule of thumb, if you will, of to get Series A funding, you need to be at $1 million in ARR. And it is true that that could be meaningful for us, but that's a bit of a blunt instrument, and it's not a hard and fast rule, because we do take things into account, like what's the quality of the revenue. Meaning, if it's low gross, it depends on the gross margins associated with that revenue. It depends on the retention of customers. There's a lot of other metrics that are important, but that actually tie into this notion of product market fit. If it's a good, if there is a fit with a core group of customers, you're going to see better retention. So I would say, some level of product market fit is the most important, and also probably. We do like to kind of see companies over time and the progress they make over time, and it's interesting to see when, when companies start attracting some key management team members that can be very meaningful as well.
And what is your definition of Series A? We are seeing a bit of a segmentation happening in the industry of people who are willing to do smaller Series A versus people who want larger Series A's, and that could vary between 1 to 3 million Series A versus 5 to 10 million Series A. What is your sweet spot or preference?
Yeah, we have a fair bit of flexibility actually. So, and we're probably more ownership oriented than we are, focused on check size. I will tell you that our range of check size, there's no sort of minimum, if you will. We probably, in terms of initial check, as a practical matter, usually don't write initial checks greater than 12 to 15 million. That would be sort of the high side for us. Our probably median is somewhere in the $7 million range for a Series A. And I think that's a bit reflective of the fact that, round sizes have just gotten bigger at every stage. What used to be considered a seed, what used to be considered a Series A would now be considered a seed often in terms of size. So we're pretty flexible. We can play, pretty much any size round, whether it's a $3 million round or a $10 million round. And what we're more focused on is, ownership. So we look for 20% plus ownership in the investments that we make. And we typically lead or co-lead, and we typically look to take a board seat. And, because our philosophy is, it isn't just about the capital, it's also about really partnering with the entrepreneur to try to make, the company as successful as we can. And, the more we've got wood behind the arrow, the more, our interests are aligned. So that's our philosophy.
And what, in terms of segments besides real estate tech, what else do you particularly like to invest in? Is healthcare IT one of your sectors?
I would say broadly, I spend a lot of my time in the consumer space, consumer-driven markets. And so that can be anything from, marketplaces to e-commerce or, online services. And so in the marketplace arena, I've had an investment theme around the sharing economy for many years, I think probably since that term evolved. And, I'm an investor in Turo, which is a peer-to-peer car rental marketplace. I'm an investor in ThredUp, was the first institutional investor there. ThredUp is a marketplace for gently used clothing. Actually, in the marketplace arena, I was also an investor in Care.com, the marketplace for services, now a public company. And actually, another theme is, for many years, in addition to the sharing economy, another theme for investment theme for me was what I call the she economy, which is sort of, recognizing the important role of women as, as basically, kind of chief procurement officers for their households, and also as kind of very active participants in social media, which is important from a sort of customer acquisition, referral, building referral networks, et cetera. So that was one theme. So those are some of the areas that I've spent time on. I continue to think the sharing economy world is really interesting. In fact, sort of at the intersection of that and real estate are some really interesting concepts that I've been spending some time looking at, which is how do you make more efficient use of real estate? And it's sort of, a lot of these themes also coincide with an emerging consumer theme around being more experience-driven and more interested in experiences than in ownership, if you will. And, we've read a lot about...
It's a big trend right now, I think.
Exactly. And, so instead of owning a car, you might take Uber and Lyft, and for, day-long or multi-day trips, you might rent a car on Turo. And, instead of necessarily, owning your furniture, you might rent your furniture. And so that allows you to not be sort of burdened by ownership. It also allows you to change things more readily. There's less friction if you want to change things out in your life and introduce some variety to it. So there's some interesting consumer themes. You know, one of the interesting things that I've been spending some time thinking about too is just sort of, you know, the opportunity to build brands at this juncture, just because you know, I think consumers, particularly younger consumers, are really, I don't feel a lot of affiliation to the larger CPG brands that are out there, and are really embracing new brands that are values-driven. In fact, actually, I was just meeting with a company, and I kind of liked how they describe themselves. They're like value with values. So they're like providing values, like a better value proposition to the consumer, but wrapped in like values that can be very important, like environmental sustainability and et cetera. So anyway, I think it's been fascinating to see a lot of direct-to-consumer brands, you know, emerge that really speak to a new generation. And frankly, you know, often taking political stands and the kind of that it's harder for larger established brands to take because they have a very diverse customer base.
Yeah. So good segue actually into the hairy question that our industry is really grappling with, is the issue of women and entrepreneurship and bias and sexual harassment and all that. Give us some general thoughts on how you are parsing the whole world around us on those topics.
Well, you know, there are two separate topics. You know, one is sort of sexual harassment, and then the other one is sort of, you know, the lack of gender and ethnic diversity in the investing community. Which translates, I think, to lower funding to those populations from an entrepreneurship level. So, you know, the sexual harassment piece, I would say, you know, thank goodness that there's been a spotlight shined on that. I mean, I personally, I was, you know, surprised at the depth of it. I mean, I actually lecture at Stanford Business School, and I remember when some of these stories first started coming to light a few years ago. I mean, they crescendoed, I think, in the last year, but the stories started coming out a couple of years ago, and I remember speaking to students at Stanford about it, and I was surprised at the number of women in the class who basically had their own personal stories of having been harassed, you know, in conversations with investors in sort of a power position. So I'm delighted that there's been like a spotlight shined on it, and I think a lot of that behavior, hopefully, is getting addressed, and that there are means to surface that kind of behavior more readily than I think there was in the past. And frankly, I applaud a lot of the young women who've like raised their hands very bravely and put themselves out there, because I think in the past, I think there was a little bit of an approach of, you know, I'm just gonna, this is kind of a private matter that happened to me, and I'm just gonna kind of deal with it and move on. And I think a lot of young women are bravely kind of putting themselves out there. So that's
one comment I want to, you know, highlight on this is that the big difference I see in how the issue is being recorded or reported right now is people are actually naming names. That was not at all common earlier on. Even if there were incidents reported, people were not naming names. Now they are, and I think it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. And you know, but I even as recently as the Ellen Powell trial, I mean, there were names listed there, and somehow there were no repercussions, or it didn't seem like there were as many repercussions.
But I'm sorry, Ellen Powell doesn't have a lot of credibility with me because she was sleeping with a partner at Kleiner who was a married guy. So, I mean, that's not a credible situation. That's not a sexual harassment situation.
but there were in the trial there was testimony from other people at Kleiner, indicating sexual harassment situations that I thought didn't get the attention that they deserve. But anyway, there's that whole set of issues. But then there's sort of the systemic long-term issue of not of very few women in the investor community and very few people of color, and then the impact of that in terms of where the dollars flow. And I think there's also been a lot of awareness built around that as well.
Yeah.
And I think that we're seeing a lot of hiring going on. We're seeing a lot of firms hire their first woman, which is great. And some of them are being hired, at the partner level, which I think is really key, because I don't think, it's enough to just hire at the junior level and sort of claim you check the box, if you will.
Right. And, the other question that is very relevant to this discussion is what you were talking about earlier, is women being the decision makers, the chief procurement officer, as you call them, in the household, or in a lot of different categories. The buyer, the actual decision maker in the buying cycle, is the woman. And traditionally, a lot of entrepreneurs who have worked in that category have found it very difficult to get through to investors, because these investors are mostly men and they have no idea about how the psychology of that buying cycle works. And as a result, they pass, not because they don't want to invest in women, or it's just because they don't understand the business.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. It's I remember when I invested in Care.com, I remember when Sheila Marcella came in for the partner meeting, and I think it was really valuable for me to explain to my partners that at the time I was spending $300 a year just to have a backup nanny service, just to have a backup, babysitting service that I could call if my babysitter called in sick. And it was like an insurance policy. And I think it was helpful for me to have that personal experience, to be able to share it, because it made my partners realize how mission critical childcare is to a working mother. And so I think I totally agree, which is those personal experiences that can help you sort of understand at a visceral level the potential market opportunity.
Yeah. As you remember, I did fashion as one of my companies, and in 1999, I mean, hardly anybody had any idea about what the hell that was.
Yeah, yes, that's true. I know.
So, any parting comments before you head off to the audience?
I would just say that, I resonate to your comments at the beginning before we started the interview, which is, in some ways, it's like never been a better time to be an entrepreneur in terms of the resources available and the information available. I really do think that there's, that it's not a completely level playing field, and probably never will be, but I do think that access to information and is as good as it's ever been, and resources. And so anyway, I just kind of wish everybody the best on their entrepreneurial journey, and encourage everybody to take advantage of the resources that are out there.
Well, thank you, Patricia, for participating today, and we'll be in touch.
Okay. Thanks, Sharmana. Good to chat with you.
Good to chat.